The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a metronome against the stillness of the house. James Litton sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by a scatter of papers and the hum of his laptop. A history teacher at Eastwood High, he was used to the quiet monotony of grading essays about the Revolutionary War or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But today, the silence felt heavy. His wife, Mary, had gone to her weekly book club meeting, or so she said. Their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, was at school. For once, James was alone with his thoughts. He glanced at his phone, where a picture of his family graced the lock screen. Emily grinning toothily, her front teeth just starting to grow back in, and Mary leaning against his shoulder, radiant in the glow of a summer sunset. A knot tightened in his chest. Lately, something felt off. Mary's smile seemed different, brighter for strangers, dimmer at home. She'd been distracted, her phone always glued to her hand, her explanations for late nights increasingly vague. James brushed the thought aside. Mary had always been independent. Perhaps he was overthinking. The distant creak of the front door broke his focus. James frowned. School wouldn't let out for another 2 hours. Rising from his chair, he stepped into the hallway. "Emily?" he called, expecting silence. Instead, her small voice responded, "It's me, Dad." Her tone stopped him cold. She sounded off like she was holding back tears. Emily stepped into view, her pink backpack hanging limp from her shoulders, her cheeks flushed. James knelt to her level, concern etched on his face. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. "What's wrong? Why are you home early?" She hesitated, her small fingers fiddling with the straps of her bag. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "There was a substitute today," she mumbled. "They let us out after lunch because of an emergency." James nodded slowly, sensing there was more. "Okay, but something's bothering you. What happened?" Emily's lip quivered, and she finally looked up at him. Her wide, tear-filled eyes were mirrors of Mary's, and the resemblance hit James with a pang. "I don't want to get in trouble," she whispered. "You are not in trouble, sweetheart," he assured her. "You can tell me anything." Her shoulders hunched, and she glanced toward the stairs, then back at her father. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as though someone might overhear. "Yesterday, I came home early like today. I went upstairs to your room." James's breath caught. The weight in her voice twisted something deep in his chest. He didn't interrupt. Emily pressed on, her words tumbling out in a hushed rush. "The door wasn't locked, so I went in. I saw Mom with a man. They were doing weird stuff." James froze. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to those words, looping over and over in his mind. "What kind of weird stuff, Em?" he asked gently, though his voice had a faint tremor. Emily flushed deeply. They were hugging and kissing. "She didn't see me at first, but then she did. She got so mad, Dad." Her voice broke and she clutched his arm. "She said if I ever told you, she'd send me to an orphanage." James pulled her into his arms, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could feel her shaking, her little frame trembling like a leaf in a storm. Anger surged through him, not at Emily, never at her, but at the woman he had built his life around. His wife, his partner. Betrayal had a taste, metallic and bitter, and it was thick on his tongue. "You are not going anywhere," James said fiercely. "I promise. You are my daughter. You'll always be with me." Emily sniffled against his shoulder. "Do you believe me?" James pulled back, cupping her tear-streaked face. "I believe you, Em. I believe every word." As she clung to him, he felt a cold clarity seep into his veins. He had spent the last 15 years building a life with Mary, believing in her, trusting her. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he could have imagined. But worse than the infidelity was the cruelty she had shown their child. A dark resolve began to take root. "Why don't you go grab some things for a sleepover at Sophie's house?" he suggested. Sophie was Emily's best friend. Her parents were kind, reliable people who wouldn't think twice about taking Emily for the night. "You can stay there while I sort some things out." Emily hesitated, then nodded. James watched her disappear up the stairs. her steps lighter now that the burden had been lifted from her small shoulders. When she returned with her overnight bag, James drove her to Sophie's, forcing a calm he didn't feel. Emily waved as she ran to the door, her smile a little brighter than before. James sat in the car for a long time after. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The image of Mary and another man played on an endless loop in his mind. His house felt tainted, a facade of warmth and love, hiding betrayal and lies. He couldn't go back inside without confronting the truth. Later that evening, James stood in the backyard, staring at the mound of his wife's belongings. Her clothes, her keepsakes, even her favorite books, everything that could remind him of her. The matchbook in his hand trembled slightly as he struck it, watching the small flame leap to life. The fire caught quickly, hungrily consuming the pile. Orange and red flames danced in the twilight, their flickering light reflected in James's steely gaze. The smoke curled upward, a physical manifestation of his heartbreak and fury. As he watched the fire burn, he felt no sadness, only a cold satisfaction. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. Mary's car pulled into the driveway, the headlights briefly illuminating the darkened yard. She stepped out, her heels clicking on the pavement as she approached the house. She froze when she saw the fire. "James?" she called hesitantly. "What's going on?" He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "It's over, Mary." Her face paled. She took a step back, her eyes darting from the fire to her husband. What do you mean?" James took a deliberate step forward, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I know, Mary. I know everything." She swayed on her feet, her hand flying to her mouth, and as she crumpled to the ground in a faint, James didn't move to catch her. He simply stood there, silhouetted by the flames, the storm in his heart reflected in his her lashes fluttering as consciousness returned. The acrid scent of smoke pulled her fully awake. She sat up, disoriented, her dress streaked with dirt from where she had collapsed. As her vision cleared, the orange glow of flames danced before her, illuminating the night like a harbinger of doom. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in the smoldering pile of her belongings. Her mind reeled. Dresses she had worn on vacations, photo albums filled with memories, and books she had collected over the years, all reduced to ashes. "What have you done?" she cried, her voice trembling with shock. James stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. He didn't respond, his silence louder than any accusation. His eyes, normally kind and steady, burned with an intensity that made her stomach churn. Mary staggered to her feet, shaking off her dizziness. "James, stop this madness. Why are you doing this?" "You know why," he said flatly, his voice low and icy. "Don't you dare play innocent." Mary's heart pounded, her mind scrambling for an explanation, a defense, anything that could diffuse the storm brewing between them. Her gaze darted to the house. "Emily," she whispered, panic lacing her voice. "W here is Emily?" She turned and ran toward the back door, her heels slipping on the uneven grass. The cool night air stung her skin, mixing with the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She threw the door open and stumbled into the house, shouting her daughter's name. "Emily, where are you, sweetheart? It's okay. Mommy's here." The house felt eerily quiet, as though it were holding its breath. Mary's footsteps echoed through the hallway as she searched each room, her voice rising in desperation. When she reached Emily's bedroom, she found it empty, the bed neatly made, her daughter's favorite stuffed bear sitting forlornly on the pillow. "James!" Mary screamed, turning on her heel. "What have you done with her?" She stormed back down the stairs, where James stood in the dim light of the entryway, his tall frame blocking the path to the front door. His expression was unreadable, but his clenched fists and rigid posture radiated fury. "Emily is safe," he said coldly. "She's with people who care about her, people who don't manipulate and threaten her." Mary's knees buckled slightly as the weight of his words hit her. "What are you talking about? She's my daughter. She belongs with me." Belongs with you? James's voice rose, his calm facade cracking as his anger spilled out. Do you think a mother who threatens her children's own flesh and blood with an orphanage deserves to raise her? Mary's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her mind raced to process his words. She told you, she whispered, the realization sinking in like a stone in water. Of course she told me, James exploded, his voice thunderous. She's 10, Mary, 10. And you traumatized her so badly that she was afraid to come home yesterday. What kind of person does that? Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. I didn't mean it like that, she pleaded. I just panicked. I didn't know how else to make her stay quiet. James laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. That's your excuse? You panicked? You've had months years to come clean, to admit your lies, and instead, you dragged Emily into your filth. Mary's tears spilled over, streaking her cheeks. James, please, you have to believe me. It wasn't like that. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. James took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. You didn't mean to hurt anyone? You betrayed me, Mary. You broke your vows. You threatened our daughter. And for what? Some fling with some random man? It wasn't like that, she insisted, her voice trembling. It wasn't meaningless. Oh, so it was serious then? James sneered. That makes it so much better. Mary's legs felt weak, her head spinning as the enormity of the situation crashed down on her. She tried to reach for him, her hands trembling. James, I'm sorry. Please, let's just talk about this. We can fix it. James jerked away, his expression hardening. Here is no fixing this. You made your choice. Now you live with the consequences. Mary's panic deepened. Her mind raced for a way out, a way to regain control. Her eyes landed on her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had dropped it earlier. Without thinking, she darted toward it, grabbing the device and frantically dialing. What are you doing? James demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. Mary held the phone to her ear, her hands trembling. You've lost your mind, James. I'm calling the police. For a moment he looked stunned. Then a bitter smile curled his lips. Go ahead, he said quietly. Call them. But you'd better tell them the whole story, about how you tore this family apart. The line connected. Mary's voice was shaky as she spoke into the receiver. Hello? Yes, I need help. My husband is. He's burning my things and threatening me. Please, send someone quickly. James's eyes never left hers as she gave their address. When she hung up, the room seemed to crackle with tension. You think calling the cops will save you? He said, his voice low and venomous. You think they'll hear your lies and paint you as the victim? Just wait until they find out why I am doing this. Mary swallowed hard, clutching the phone like a lifeline. They'll protect me, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. James stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. We'll see about that. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the tense silence, growing louder with each passing second. Mary backed away, her heart pounding as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the windows. For the first time that night, a flicker of fear crossed James's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He stepped back, his gaze cold and resolute. This isn't over, Mary, not by a long shot. As the front door burst open and officers entered the house, Mary felt a momentary surge of relief. But beneath it all, a gnawing dread remained. James was right, this wasn't over. Lights bathed the street in an eerie glow, their rhythm reflecting Mary's erratic heartbeat. She stood at the edge of the living room, her arms crossed defensively, her phone still clutched tightly in one hand. Two officers, one older with a grizzled face, and the other younger, just past rookie age, stood between her and James. The silence was punctuated only by the crackle of the fire outside, faint but steady, like a heartbeat in the night. Mary took a step forward, tears pooling in her eyes. Officers, she began, her voice trembling but determined. You have to help me. My husband's lost his mind. He burned all my things. He's threatened me. and I am terrified of what he'll do next." James stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, his eyes boring into Mary as though daring her to continue. The younger officer glanced at James, then back at Mary. "Ma'am," he said cautiously, "we're here to help, but we need to understand the situation. Can you explain why your husband would do something like this?" Mary nodded vigorously, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I don't know," she exclaimed, her voice pitching higher. "He's been acting strange for weeks, paranoid and distant. Tonight I came home, and he'd set all my belongings on fire. When I asked why, he just kept accusing me of things I didn't do." James finally stirred, his jaw tightening as he looked at the older officer. "This is unbelievable." The older officer raised a hand, signaling for silence, his stern gaze sweeping between them. "We'll hear both sides, Mr. Litton." "Ma'am," he turned back to Mary, "you said he accused you of things. What exactly did he accuse you of?" Mary hesitated, her eyes darting to James. He thinks I've been unfaithful." Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth as if the accusation alone was too painful to say aloud. "But it's not true. I would never do that to my family. I don't know what's gotten into him." James let out a sharp, humorless laugh, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Not true?" he said, his tone calm but dripping with venom. "That's quite a performance, Mary. But why don't you tell them the whole truth?" The younger officer's brow furrowed, glancing between them. "Sir, if you have evidence to support your claims, now would be the time to share it." James nodded, his movements deliberate as he stepped toward the kitchen counter. He picked up his phone, swiping through it with practiced precision. "I didn't want to bring Emily into this," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But she came to me because she was scared. She saw things a child should never see. My wife told her that if she spoke up, she'd be sent to an orphanage." The older officer's eyes narrowed. "Is that true, ma'am?" Mary's face flushed, her voice rising in panic. "No, that's a lie. I would never say something like that to Emily. He's twisting things around." James ignored her, holding his phone out to the officers. "Here, listen for yourselves." He pressed play, and Emily's small, shaky voice filled the room. It was a recording, taken earlier that day. "I went into the bedroom, and Mom was with a man. She told me I'd go to an orphanage if I told Dad." The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the recording as it ended. Mary's mouth opened and closed, her words faltering under the weight of the evidence. The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable, while the older one's expression hardened. "Mrs. Litton," the older officer said, his tone firm, "do you have an explanation for this?" Mary's hands trembled. That isn't what it sounds like. I was upset, okay? I might have said something I didn't mean, but I wasn't serious. Emily misunderstood." James cut her off, his voice low and controlled. "Emily didn't misunderstand, and neither will the court, Mary, if you keep lying." The officers exchanged a glance. The younger one stepped forward, his voice gentler than his partner's. "Ma'am, if to hear is more to this story, now's the time to share it. Otherwise, the recording is pretty damning." Mary's defenses began to crumble. She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. "It's not fair," she sobbed. "I made a mistake. But this is a setup. James is trying to paint me as a monster." James raised an eyebrow. "A monster? No, Mary. I am just showing them who you really are." The older officer sighed, his tone weary. "Look, folks, this isn't something the police are equipped to handle. This is a domestic dispute, and from what I can see, T here is no immediate threat to either of you. We're not here to mediate your marriage." "But," Mary began, but the officer raised a hand to stop her. "We're done here, Mr. Litton," he continued, turning to James. "I suggest you both take some time to cool off. If you are planning to separate, consult your lawyers and handle your affairs through the courts. Burning her belongings might not have been the best way to go about this, but it's your property. We're not going to interfere unless things escalate." Mary stared at the officers, her face a mix of disbelief and outrage. "You are just going to leave? He destroyed everything I own." The older officer fixed her with a steady gaze. "Ma'am, if you feel unsafe, you can file for a protective order. But right now, here is no immediate danger. You two need to handle this like adults." James crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, officers. I'll take care of it from here." The officers nodded, their presence receding as they made their way back to the squad car. Mary stood frozen, her mind racing. She couldn't believe they had sided with him. She turned to James, her chest heaving with suppressed anger. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You've turned Emily against me, lied to the police, and destroyed my things. You think you are the victim, but you are the one tearing this family apart." James stared at her, his voice eerily calm. "No, Mary. You did that the moment you betrayed us. Now it's time to face the consequences." Mary's fists clenched, her mind racing for her next move. But for now, James had the upper hand, and the storm between them was far from sky, the kind that promised rain but withheld its release. James sat at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee in his hands. The faint smell of ash lingered in the air, drifting through the open window from the remains of Mary's belongings in the backyard. His thoughts were heavy, weighted by the events of the previous night. He couldn't stop replaying Emily's trembling confession, the fear in her voice that shattered something deep inside him. He had failed to protect her, but he vowed he wouldn't let that happen again. The quiet of the house was broken by the sound of the guest room door creaking open. Mary's footsteps echoed faintly on the stairs, slower than usual, each one hesitant. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by a restless night. For a moment she stood there, as though summoning the courage to speak. "James," she finally said, her voice soft but tense, "we need to talk." He didn't look at her. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the mug in his hands, his fingers tightening around it. "We've talked enough," he said coldly. Mary hesitated, then stepped further into the room, pulling out the chair across from him. She sat down, clasping her hands tightly in front of her, as if they might betray her thoughts. "I know you are angry," she began, her tone pleading. "And I know I've made mistakes. But we can't keep doing this. It's tearing us apart, and it's not good for Emily." At the mention of their daughter, James finally looked up. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, met hers with an intensity that made her shrink back slightly. "Don't," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Don't you dare try to play the concerned parent now. You scared her so badly she thought she couldn't come home. That's what's tearing this family apart." Tears welled in Mary's eyes, and she reached for his hand, but he pulled it away sharply. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she said, her voice breaking. "I was scared, James. Scared that if she told you, you'd leave, you'd take her away from me." James shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "So your solution was to threaten her? To make her think she'd lose both of us? What kind of mother does that?" "I panicked," Mary cried, her tears flowing freely now. "I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't know what else to do." "You could have told the truth," James snapped, his voice rising. "You could have owned up to your mistakes instead of dragging our daughter into your mess." Mary's composure cracked, her frustration spilling out in a bitter wave. "And what about you, James? Burning my things? Turning Emily against me? Acting like you are so perfect, like you've never made mistakes." "This isn't about me," he said, his voice cold and steady. "This is about you and the choices you made. You are the one who betrayed this family, not me." Mary stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes flashed with anger, her hands clenched into fists. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking. "You want to make this my fault? Go ahead, but you are not taking Emily away from me." James rose slowly, his tall frame looming over her as he spoke. "She's staying with me because she deserves stability, and you've proven you can't provide that." For a moment, Mary said nothing, her chest heaving as she tried to control her emotions. Then she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, retreating to the guest bedroom. James heard the door slam, followed by the muffled sound of her voice. She was on the phone, likely calling the man she had betrayed him with. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay seated, though every part of him wanted to burst in and confront her. Instead, he focused on what came next. The evidence he had: Emily's recording. The texts and emails was damning, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The courts didn't always favor fathers, even when they should. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, explaining the situation in careful detail. "You'll need more than just the recording," the lawyer said. "The courts might still side with her as the mother unless you can show her behavior has a direct impact on Emily's well-being." James nodded grimly. "Then I'll get what I need. Whatever it takes." Hours passed in tense silence. Mary emerged from the guest room in the early evening, her face a mask of forced calm. She had changed into fresh clothes and applied makeup, though the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed her. She walked into the living room, her posture stiff, and stopped in front of James. "I spoke to my lawyer," she announced. "If you want to take this to court, fine. But don't think I'll let you take everything from me." James didn't look up from the laptop he was working on. "Do whatever you need to do, Mary," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'll be ready." She stood there for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out the front door. James watched through the window as she got into her car and drove off, her tires screeching as she turned the corner. The house fell silent again, the air heavy with the weight of what was to come. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. But he would fight with everything he had to protect Emily. The days that followed were a blur of tense phone calls, legal consultations, and mounting unease. James had started preparing for the inevitable custody battle, gathering every piece of evidence that painted a clear picture of Mary's instability and betrayal. Emily remained at Sophie's house, unaware of the storm brewing around her, but James could feel its weight every time he spoke with her on the phone. Her voice, small and hesitant, was a reminder of why he couldn't afford to falter. Mary had returned only sporadically to the house since their confrontation. When she did, the air was suffocating with unspoken words and simmering tension. They avoided each other, speaking only when necessary, their exchanges curt and devoid of the warmth they once shared. But James knew it was the quiet before the storm. One evening, as James sat at the dining table reviewing court documents, he heard the unmistakable sound of Mary's car pulling into the driveway. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't mentioned she'd be coming back that night, but he wasn't surprised. Mary had become unpredictable, her actions erratic, as though she were clinging to some shred of control. The front door creaked open, and Mary stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She stood in the doorway for a moment, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Her eyes met James's, and for the first time in days there was no anger in her gauzy-only exhaustion. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. James set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Go ahead." Mary took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she placed her purse on the counter. "I don't want to fight anymore," she said, her voice wavering. This isn't what I wanted." James's expression remained stoic, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What did you want, Mary? A family you could lie to? A husband who would look the other way?" Her face crumpled, tears spilling over as she sank into a chair across from him. "I wanted to feel loved," she whispered. "Wanted to feel. Wanted. You were always so busy with work, with Emily, with everything else. And I felt invisible." James's chest tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So your solution was to destroy the life we built together? To betray me? To hurt Emily?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't plan for any of this. It just happened." "That's not good enough, Mary," James said, his voice rising. "You don't get to use feeling neglected as an excuse to ruin our family." Mary wiped her tears, her expression hardening. You think I am the only one at fault here? You were absent too, James, always working late, always distracted. You think I didn't notice how distant you'd become? James leaned forward, his eyes blazing. I worked late to provide for us, to give you and Emily the life you wanted. I trusted you, Mary. That was my mistake. The room fell silent, the weight of their words pressing down like a physical force. Finally, Mary stood, her shoulders slumping as though the fight had left her entirely. You've already made up your mind, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No matter what I say, you'll never forgive me. James didn't respond. He watched as she walked toward the door, her steps slow and heavy. Just as she reached for the handle, she turned back to him. I'll see you in court, she said. And don't think for a second that I won't fight for Emily. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality, and James sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen. He stared at the documents spread before him, the legal jargon blurring together as his thoughts raced. Mary's words echoed in his mind, but he refused to let them sway him. This wasn't about their broken marriage anymore. It was about protecting Emily. The court date arrived on a rainy Monday morning. The courthouse was bustling with activity, the halls filled with murmured conversations and the distant shuffle of papers. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him, a neatly organized binder of evidence at their disposal. Mary sat across the room, her posture stiff, her lawyer whispering in her ear. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Each side presented their case, but James's lawyer was methodical, laying out the facts with precision. The recording of Emily's confession was played, her small voice echoing through the courtroom like a ghost. Mary's lawyer objected, arguing it was out of context, but the judge allowed it. James remained composed throughout the hearing, even as Mary's lawyer attempted to paint him as overly controlling and emotionally detached. But when it was Mary's turn to testify, her composure faltered. Her explanations were shaky, her attempts to justify her actions riddled with contradictions. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as Mary fumbled through her testimony. Finally, it was James's turn to speak. He looked directly at the judge, his voice steady as he described his love for his daughter and his determination to provide her with a safe, stable home. He spoke of the betrayal, the pain of discovering the truth, and his fears for Emily's emotional well-being if left in Mary's care. When the judge delivered the ruling, James's heart pounded in his chest. Primary custody of the child, Emily Litton, will be awarded to Mr. James Litton. Mrs. Mary Litton will have supervised visitation rights pending further evaluation. The weight of those words lifted the tension that had gripped James for weeks. He glanced at Mary, who sat frozen, her face pale and stricken. Her lawyer leaned toward her, speaking in hushed tones, but she didn't seem to hear him. As James left the courtroom, he felt a bittersweet sense of relief. The battle was over, but the scars remained. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, healing Emily's wounds, rebuilding their lives, but he was ready to face it. When he picked Emily up that evening, her smile was brighter than it had been in weeks. She threw her arms around him, her small voice filled with hope as she said, "I am glad to be home, Dad." James held her close, his heart heavy yet resolute. For Emily, he would endure anything. And as he drove them back to their house, he knew that while their family would never be the same, they would find a way forward together. What would you do if faced with such betrayal and heartbreak? Share your thoughts on James's choices and Mary's actions in the comments below.